Welcome everyone to the final presentation of Source Zero Con. This is the final keynote presentation presented by myself, John Helmus. So that I don't take up a lot of area on the screen with my face, I've gone ahead and given a black and white headshot or mugshot, as you can see down there in the bottom right. Before we get going with this conversation, I just want to make a shout out to all of you and everyone at Source Zero Con who has made this an interactive, fun, and engaging experience for the past few days. None of this would be possible without you. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and start talking about what we're going to sit here and cap off this 3 days of fun with. So we're going to be talking about cloud security. More directly, we're going to be talking about how you secure the cloud. So, to start off, it's probably good to tell you who I am. Well, as you can see up here, we're kind of funneling all this information into a TXT file that says Moosey. So Moosey is my handle that I go by. However, please feel free to call me John, but a lot of people just call me Moosey or Moose. I am a feral security dude, currently doing a lot of different things for quite a few different organizations, doing offensive security such as pen testing, as well as a little bit of red teaming right now. I'm an author. I have authored the book AWS Penetration Testing, which is a beginner's guide to help those that are trying to understand pen testing and a little bit of AWS and kind of, run both of those parallel with each other. I'm also a content creator. I do a platform called Offensive Security Interviews where I create content that's in the form of stories and interviews, as well as do things such as technical videos that, illustrate technical challenges. I'm also a podcaster. I'm on the Offensive Security Interviews podcast, as I mentioned, as well as the Hackers and Hexen podcast, a podcast between myself, Erica McDuffie, and Jack Scott, where we have a bunch of conversations with different folks that help bring stories and highlight ways of how folks can get into cybersecurity. And more directly, we like to focus on women trying to get into cybersecurity. I'm also a professor and educator. I teach various cybersecurity courses at City University of Seattle, National University, and Metro State University, as well as do some volunteering with Virtually Testing and Hack the Box. I'm based out of Seattle, so I am naturally the ambassador for the Seattle group. And then out of all the things that I have, credentials and degrees wise, I always like to say that I have the OSCP and that I cried harder instead of trying harder. So what's up with these cloud breaches though? That's the big question. Okay? This is going to be essentially the tone that we're going to be taking throughout the entire conversation, discussion, presentation that we're going to be doing here for the next little bit. Okay? So what's up with all these cloud breaches? I want you to sit there and think about it for a second about why are we seeing cloud breaches? And think about those first thoughts that are going to come into your head and run with those assumptions as we go throughout this talk. Okay, so a good thing to note, right? We need to look at the amount of landscape that the cloud is taking over before we do anything. So 70% of the world's businesses now operate in the cloud. That's a large amount. Not to mention, most large companies all have cloud infrastructure. So, like any new technology though, right, we're adopting this new technology into our enterprises. Cloud computing adoption opens up new forms of security risks. And as we are going to see throughout this presentation, and as many of you already know, bringing on the cloud, while it is secure by default, does not necessarily mean that we are adding secure infrastructure into our already existing infrastructure. Okay? So we're going to need to look up some numbers. Let's talk about the numbers. This is the thing that you would go to the board and talk about. And this is why we need to implement better security in our cloud, right? So studies show the majority of companies are actually concerned about their public cloud security. And we're going to talk a lot about the public and the private cloud. Okay. And for those of you thinking, well, John, what studies? There's also going to be a resource tab at the end of this conversation that will tell you where I got the information from, and feel free to hit me up if you want to know more, okay? Around 90% though of folks are worried. And by folks, I mean higher leadership in these companies that are taking on the cloud. 70% have experienced a breach within 12 months. So that means 7 out of every 10 companies is experiencing a cloud breach. And I'm going to give you a little bit of insight here. Some of these companies don't always hit the big main news. Sometimes they kind of fall through the cracks a little bit for whatever reason. I'm going to essentially conclude that to do a couple Google searches, see what companies have faced these breaches within the past couple years, because you'll be surprised at what major companies have suffered a cloud breach. And then if we bring that 12 months and we take it and extend it out 18 months, we're getting up another 10%. Does that mean if we go to 24 months, we could expect the same inflation and it go to 90%? What about if we go to 3 years? Does that mean every company within 3 years is going to experience a cloud breach? Those are things to think about. And it's our job as security professionals and security enthusiasts to make that number go backwards, not forwards. So the big thing that we want to think about is, why are we having these breaches and what are causing those breaches? And for those of you that may have seen previous talks that I've given, this is actually a slide from a previous talk that I've given that revolves around cloud pen testing and how we have to rethink the wheel of how we pen test the cloud, because it doesn't work in the way how we've been doing it. So what is causing the breaches? We have 1, 2, and 3, and then we have the why, 1, 2, and 3. It's linear here, okay? So they match from 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3. Misconfigurations maintain the largest issue. Why is that, though? Think about it. For those of you that work with cloud infrastructure, such as like AWS, Azure, GCP, what's some of the issues that you have to tackle in your daily life and work to help make sure those issues aren't there? Well, I'm sure that you know that it's not always easy to configure a cloud environment, especially when you go to scale. And because of this, we're seeing a rise in the cloud market, but we're also seeing a rise in breaches. And those misconfigurations are typically caused because of not enough time, lack of training, because you don't have enough time to train, or your company might not pay for your training and you just don't have the resources or the budget to pay for it. And it causes essentially this trickle effect where it just starts to go everywhere. Another big issue is that keys often get left in repos or unsecured data storage. Things like AWS keys are a big hit, right? AWS keys getting left in GitHub repos, things like that. Stolen credentials are another big thing. That honestly is a big, big issue. And a big part of that is because it's a lack of understanding of how we use these cloud secrets and how they really are a big deal. And then number 3 is something that I think has really hit all of us, whether we live and breathe cloud security or not. But a lot of companies have had to move to the cloud because of budget cuts. It's cheaper to work in the cloud because you're only billed for what you use. Rather than having to go and stand up a bunch of physical infrastructure, you just bring it up in the cloud and bring it down when you don't need to use it. Remote workforce. We've all had to go virtual for the most part. Notice how I said the most part. Well, the cloud is kind of virtual. It's kind of like taking our physical infrastructure and being like, all right, you're going to work remotely. So it works and it aligns with our workforce right now. A lot of times, too, we just want to stay up to date. We don't want to be that kid who falls behind and doesn't hop onto the cloud. And then scaling. It's a very, very competitive market out there, folks. And we want to make sure that we scale our infrastructure and we're able to keep up. So why is this an issue, though? Well, things are moving faster than a lot of times than we can keep up. For those of you listening, working in security, working in IT, I would place bets that all of us have suffered some kind of burnout during the COVID era because we have to work a lot more. And because that work-life balance has become kind of muddy because of only working from home. So, another interesting fact, though. 44% of attacks also involve misconfigured WAFs, web application firewall. So that just also means like a good almost half of this stuff is happening because of weak perimeter security. So as we're starting to see misconfigurations, lack of training, lack of resources, are we supporting our folks that are manning the cloud front lines, that are securing our cloud borders? Maybe that's a question to throw into that basket of assumptions that we, kind of pondered at the beginning of this talk. Another thing, too, to think about is this grocery list, essentially, that I have here. Okay? We got our little digital shopping cart. And you're going to see that this is a bunch of threat and issues that will target the cloud. And as you can see, a lot of them are things that also target physical infrastructure. It's really not that big of a difference. However, if you notice, there's the abuse and nefarious use of cloud services. That's something that we really need to make sure that we are building safeguards around. We need to make sure that we understand those safeguards that we're placing around them. Okay? Shared technology vulnerabilities. We want to make sure that we're not putting weak technology on top of these servers and services that we're using in the cloud. Because just because if the services and servers are configured correctly, but the technology on top of them is not, well, we're going to run into issues. Due diligence, a lot of times that just turns into misuse or misaction. A lot of times it's misaction, to be honest. We accidentally do something because we didn't understand the technology we were working with. Or we just by chance didn't configure it correctly, and therefore something by accident happened. So we need to make sure that when we're doing all of this, that we are essentially creating security within the cloud. And when we are practicing cloud security, we actually understand what we're doing. And I'm not making a call out to anyone directly. I'm just saying in general, as we move forward in the technology era, and the cloud becomes more and more part of that technology era. Challenges with securing the cloud. Right? We had this list of issues, threats, and that is going to target our cloud infrastructure. But what's the challenge with actually securing it, right? You can't just say, okay, we're going to throw a bunch of education at you and, have at it. There's still issues there. It's a dynamic environment, especially if you get into multi-cloud environments where you have 2 or 3+ cloud providers within your infrastructure. That can become very cumbersome if you do not have the bandwidth to handle it. Perimeter definitions. These are going to be the things that you define your perimeter security for your cloud infrastructure. What should be in prod? What should not? How do you make sure that things that are physical and not physical are separated? How do you define the separations and the security controls and security groups around those separations? It can be time-consuming in just drawing that out. So again, we want to make sure that we have qualified and well-trained professionals manning those positions to do that. And a lot of that falls onto the companies and the training providers and to academia to make sure that we're training and educating the folks to do these jobs correctly, not just so that they know the knowledge, but that they're job ready. Loss of control of physical security. This is a big thing, and I think a lot of us might not see it right now because most of us are not in offices. But it is something good to take note of because we do lose that physical access. It's something that goes away. And once we start going back into the office, it might be something that might trip some people up. I'm not saying it's going to, but it is one of those challenges. And so it's something good to take note of. As I mentioned, the cloud is quick to scale. We all see it. We can bring up infrastructure in less than a day. Infrastructure that would have taken weeks or a month to come up with can be deployed in a matter of a day, if not hours, sometimes minutes. So we want to make sure that we're building security by design before we're worrying about scale. Staff's general lack of knowledge around cloud security. A lot of times, upper management, upper leadership might have the assumption that just because we're security personnel, folks, whatever you want to say, that we understand cloud security, and that's not necessarily the case. Cloud security is something that you have to learn. It is a new idea. It is a new methodology that you have to put into your head and that you have to practice. And then usability over security, that falls hand in hand with quick to scale. The fact that we are able to scale quicker and cheaper makes usability a big, big diamond, essentially, to go after. And the other thing is, too, is that with upper leadership, for unknowing upper leadership, they might have the assumption or the idea that because the cloud has security built in, that therefore it's secure by default, which is absolutely true for the most part. But it's once an engineer, a specialist, an administrator has to alter things within that cloud environment, within the security groups, and with the services, that's when the issues start to pop up. So we need to ensure, again, that usability is also parallel with security, and that security is parallel with usability. So how do we work around this? Well, the big thing is that we can't worry. We just need to be proactive, and we need to learn to be proactive at scale. And a big way how we're going to do that is first, we need to really look at the money that is provided within cloud computing, or the revenue, rather, for cloud computing. The cloud market currently is worth about $8 billion, right? As you can see here on this chart, which I pulled from ZDNet, we're at about 9.5. And I read a couple other studies, and they were in the high 8s, low 9s. So I wanted to just say 8-ish, okay? But as you look at this from 2016, we've gone up quite a bit. And we're forecasted to grow quite a bit. It's projected by 2027 that the cloud market's going to be worth $20 billion, folks. $20 billion. So we're expected to double in the next 7 to 6 years. So think about that, and think about as you're rethinking the way of how you're going to implement cloud security and how you're going to be proactive about training and educating your folks in cloud security about the revenue that's going to be provided within the next 7 years. So let's make sure as we get this cloud revenue up and up and up that we're going to be putting this money to good use. Okay? So how do we do that? As we can see, we can't use the same tools and solutions to assess the cloud that we've been doing, or to build out the cloud, or secure the cloud. And from the figure that you see in front of you, while it only pertains to AWS, I would argue that it pertains to just the cloud overall. So only 15% of capabilities that we've been using actually work in the cloud. And this could actually be a reason for that gap, or for that rising number of issues and breaches that we're seeing, for those causes of concern. 62% of the tools and solutions that we use only have limited functionality. Or even 23% of them just don't work. So we're only doing it half the way, or a quarter of the time, we're just not doing it at all because it just doesn't work. So then we have to spend a lot of time trying to figure it out, or go with the usability over security. So how do we rethink the wheel? Let's think about cloud threat defense and how we can actually build that into the cloud. This can go from building your own solutions to using other people's solutions to actually doing anything in there between. So for the next little bit of this presentation, we're really going to focus on how can we control, monitor, and scale that out. So let's go ahead, jump into it. As you can see, the cloud shared security model, or this is simply just put, it's usually the shared security responsibility model, shared responsibility model. This illustrates who is responsible for what on different platforms. And when we think about cloud computing, a lot of times you're going to think about infrastructure as a service because that's what you're doing. You're bringing up an entire thing of infrastructure. And notice how you lose all physical security responsibility. The issue is, though, and this is based on various research and just my own experience, is that a lot of times folks kind of get muddied and don't understand the difference between infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Software as a service is stuff like your Outlook 365. You basically don't need to worry about anything with that, right? And as I mentioned, your infrastructure as a service is the entire infrastructure that you're bringing up. That's when you're bringing up servers and services. And if you look, notice how it doesn't matter where you are, you're still responsible for compliance and data security. And yet, this is sometimes, if not all the time, the big issue. So how do we rethink that? Well, let's look at this protection control hierarchy. And I apologize that the slide is a little blurry. I tried to contrast it as best as I could. This basically is a pyramid that's going to tell you how you can properly secure your cloud from the foundational level to a less critical, less worried way of thinking. Notice how AV is at the top, right? Those are additional protections that you can put on like your servers and your services, but it's not something that you need to overly worry about. Notice here at operations hygiene. This is where you really need to focus. You need to focus on log management, change management, admin privilege management, IAM, right? These are going to be the things that we want to ensure that we're securing, because if we don't, this whole pyramid tips over. Core server protection strategies. This is things that can be applied to your servers being deployed within your cloud environment. You don't want anything to be able to get exploited, right? So maybe we do some execution prevention and protection. We need to make sure that we're putting in correct perimeter security. Notice how we have network firewalling, segmentation, and visibility. That really falls in place with our public cloud infrastructure. Hardening configuration and vulnerability management. Vulnerability management's job is to assess and minimize risk for the organization. And notice how that's at the bottom. That's right after our operations hygiene. So as you look at this, you can kind of build it out in your own head of how you could apply this in your own organization. And notice how most of it really just falls in line with the same way how we use security in a physical environment. You just have to rethink it with a little bit of cloud strategy. So here are some strategies that we can think of. Immutable servers, right? These EC2 servers that we're bringing up. For those of you working with AWS, you probably have a lot of those. You want to make sure that when you're standing those up and you're deploying them, that you have security created first. And what I mean by that is if you find an incident, and that doesn't necessarily mean a breach, it doesn't mean that you had some type of IOC. It could be something such as misuse, misaction, something not so malicious. You don't need to change the technology after the incident, because otherwise you're just essentially putting a Band-Aid over it. So create new cloud servers with a new predefined security control and policy to minimize challenges and to improve the reliability of your infrastructure. So essentially what I'm saying is create correct policies and create strict security controls that are going to help scale your cloud security. Zero trust, trust no one, verify everyone. Okay? That's becoming a popular security control within modern enterprises now, where no one is trusted and you have to be trusted based on authorization, right? And then something here at the bottom, with immutable servers in the cloud, additional steps are taken to lock down configurations, workloads, applications, and users to least privilege. This is known as acceptable usage patterns, right? And I apologize for the typo there. But we want to make sure that we're essentially building security within our policies and within our strategies, okay? So, the next thing that we're going to talk about, and I apologize that this is a little blurry as well. This is essentially, kind of think about it as the security strategy merry-go-round for cloud security, okay? So we want to make sure that we're discovering assets. Asset management is a big thing, and with the cloud and being able to scale super quickly, this can become an issue if you don't tackle it correctly. You also want to assess your security posture. The best way to do that is with vulnerability assessments, and if you want to go the extra yard, have a penetration test team look at your security posture often. You also want to make sure that you're identifying any type of security issues, and you want to do this continuously. And then you want to remediate those. And I'm sure as I'm saying this, a lot of you are looking at this and saying, John, this isn't really any different than the way of how we have been doing it in the past. And it's not. It really isn't. The only difference is that you want to make sure that you build cloud tools and models around this idea. As I mentioned before, the solutions that we've been using in the past don't really work on the cloud infrastructure that we're deploying today. So you need to take the same things that we've been doing, but put a cloud flavor on them. Monitoring user activity. This is a big, big thing. Superhuman activity, right? Those pseudo users, those admin privileged users, right? A user is logged into the cloud console or access resources from 2 different geolocations. You really don't want that to happen. You want to make sure that a user has different access based on where they're at in the world, and you want to make sure that you monitor their at. Usage spike. A user's resource consumption is out of the ordinary based on the user's previous behavior. Does that mean it's not really going in line of what they do? Is this a potential anomaly or is this an issue? What's going on? You want to make sure that you're setting up monitoring and logging that's going to detect these kind of behaviors and then alert your security staff. Data breaches. Log analysis should show access settings of any new or old resources to ensure that any sensitive data was not made public by accident, such as misuse, misaction, or malicious intent. You want to make sure that you are logging essentially everything is what I'm getting at. And that anything that falls out of scope of what is normal within your organization is logged and then verified by a security professional who understands what they're looking at. So it's on the employer to ensure that they train that employee or that group of employees what they need to be looking for. You also want to monitor workload threats. This is a big, big thing. When you're building out your cloud infrastructure and you're building security controls in place, you want to look at, is there any escalation attempts? Was it by accident? Was it not? It's your job to ensure that your teams are able to monitor that effectively and then also inspect it and verify it. And if they need to, remediate it. You also want to make sure that you're looking for malware and to make sure that it's not going into places that it should be going. We shouldn't be having malware anywhere, right? Failed attempts to take terminal access of sensitive resources. Think about that essentially as someone trying to gain access to something that they shouldn't be trying to get access to. And attempts to change key configuration files. This is a big thing. Because if you change key configuration files, you can essentially take access away or grant access to other users within that cloud environment. So as you're looking at this, I bet you're saying, John, this isn't really that different than what we're doing. It's not. Again, we're just applying a cloud flavor to it. And some other things that we want to think about when we're building out our cloud infrastructure. We want to understand that we need to have some special considerations as we move forward. AI and machine learning, which is there at the bottom, is a big thing. And there's a lot of new attack techniques coming out that are exploiting these technologies and these advancements, and also harnessing these advancements to exploit things. We need to make sure that if we're going to go multi-cloud, mixing the cloud can be dangerous, because you shouldn't assume that just because an engineer knows AWS that they know Azure or GCP or any other cloud. We also need to make sure that we make special considerations for IoT. Zero trust models are going to be your best friend with IoT, and having security by design, trusting nothing and verifying everything. Making sure that nothing that is related to IoT is put in your cloud network until it has been verified by design from a group of engineers. You also want to ensure that if you have IoT devices that are making calls to your cloud network, that those are secure as well, not just the devices inside of the cloud network. There are lots of applications being downloaded on phones that make calls to cloud networks. So you want to ensure that those applications or devices are secured. And if they're not, you need to ensure that any issues are remediated correctly. And a big thing, we need to learn to work smarter and not harder, because it can become really easy to start working harder as we go and evolve into this cloud technology era. How do we do that? A big thing, perform regularly scheduled assessments on your own cloud environments. Don't be afraid to see what is weak within your organization. I know most of us aren't. But don't be afraid to. Run regularly scheduled vulnerability assessments. Run penetration tests. And after you've done that for a while, once you've gotten to a mature point where you aren't really picking up anything on your vulnerability scanners or your pen tests, do a red team engagement. See what happens. Because the moment you have a vulnerability come up that you don't realize was there or that you don't understand, that's when you might become a statistic. And it's our job to make sure that we don't become a statistic. Have your cloud security team give training regularly. And I know this sounds silly, and especially when we are in this remote era, it can be kind of taxing on you to be in Zoom meetings all day. But have your cloud security team find ways to do interactive and integrated training with the company, or at least with folks that are going to be interacting with cloud technologies the most. Okay? And also, a big thing that I always like to say is teaching is learning, and you must be a student to be a teacher. And what that means is if you have your cloud security folks teaching, they're going to be continuous learners. So they're going to continuously update their own knowledge on the cloud. And you'll be better suited to take on the issues and challenges that come with deploying cloud technology. It also allows continuous learning to become part of the culture. Because if other folks see that they're learning, those folks may want to learn, or they may ask them. And then remove the burden and complexity of installing, maintaining typical centralized log collection solutions. Because logging is going to be your best friend. Logging and assessments, those are going to be your best friends. So make sure that you have a centralized area where everything is collected, and that it alerts you if something, out of the ordinary shows up. Reduce alert fatigue on the number of logs created on endpoints, security vendor solutions, or cloud services by creating logs that can get sent directly to threat hunting teams or to your vulnerability management team. Visualize the threats and logs collected across the cloud services to identify, fairly easy, any vulnerabilities that are in your cloud services or your servers. And make sure that you set this up so that it can be part of the dynamic environment that your cloud infrastructure is going to be. And then a big thing, make sure that you use standard security practices. You're going to have to recreate your security practices and policies for the cloud. You can't just use the old ones that you've been using. You have to revamp them and have them apply to your cloud technology. Make sure that you're doing things such as separation of duties, least privilege, perimeter security. Always monitor your public cloud technology. It has a higher risk. Think about those immutable servers. Make sure that you build security by design within your security controls, your security groups, and your security policies. Make sure that you're creating deletion policies. You don't need to have the same infrastructure up forever. This is something that we have to continuously grow and update our knowledge. And so we're going to have to, from time to time, create new infrastructure or have new infrastructure come up, but use the policies that work for us. And then the big thing, encrypt your data at use, in transit, and also at rest. And that wraps it up for my talk. I really, really appreciate everyone being here and taking the time to listen. I know at the end of a 3-day con, sometimes, the last couple talks can be a little taxing because you're just tired. So thank you again. I really, really appreciate it. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn at my name, John Helmus. I'm also on Twitter at Moosey_Moose. I have a blog that I haven't kept up with lately, but I am on Medium. You can also find me on Discord at Moosey, as well as the Hackers and Hexens podcast website that's hosted by ITSP Magazine and Offensive Security Interviews. And before I wrap up, I wanted to just give you one more bit of information that I promised you earlier in this conversation, and that are, where did I get all this information? Well, a lot of it came from the 2020 Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. That's a very, very popular report that comes out every year. I also gathered it from a Sophos security report. I also gathered it from some various different white papers that came from McAfee, DoD, and a few other just random organizations, and ZDNet.com. That's where a couple of the illustrations that you saw came from. So if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to me on these platforms. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have or just talk shop. So again, thank you everyone for sitting in, listening to this conversation, and I look forward to seeing you in the field.